Welcome back, guys, to Fear Begins. Tonight I am sharing 9 Appalachian ghost stories hikers refuse to tell out loud. These are tales that have been whispered around campfires, told only in fragments to strangers, or kept bottled up for years by those who lived through them. If you make it to the end, you might start questioning whether the woods are ever truly empty. So settle in, dim the lights, and let me know in the comments where you are watching from. The first story comes from a man named Tyler who hiked a long stretch of the Appalachian Trail in North Carolina back in 2012. He was no amateur. He had camped countless times, hiked dozens of trails, and considered himself prepared for the solitude of the mountains. He thought the only thing he had to worry about was the weather or the occasional black bear. But what he experienced during those 3 nights alone in the Smokies shook him so badly, he told no one until years later. Tyler set out in mid-October, one of those crisp weeks when the leaves had already burned into their brightest colors, gold, red, and deep orange. The air was sharp with the scent of pine and decaying leaves. He said the trail seemed almost too beautiful to be real, like walking through an oil painting. The first day passed without issue. He kept a steady pace, nodded to the few hikers heading the other direction, and by dusk he found a secluded flat spot off trail to set up his small tent. The forest was quiet, more silent than he had expected. No crickets, no owls, just the faint hiss of wind moving through the high branches. Tyler remembered thinking the silence was peaceful, even comforting. That night he cooked a small meal over his camp stove, read from his journal, and turned in early. He fell asleep quickly, the steady rustle of leaves outside his tent like a lullaby. But sometime in the middle of the night, he woke up. He could not explain why. There was no sharp noise, no flash of light. He just snapped awake with his heart pounding. For a long moment he lay still, listening. The silence pressed against him, heavy. Then he heard it, faint but clear, a low whistle drifting between the trees. It was not the kind of whistle you make to call a dog. It was slower, longer, like someone drawing breath and letting it escape through pursed lips. Tyler froze, straining to hear. At first he thought maybe it was another camper nearby, but the sound did not move like a person would. It seemed to circle his camp, gliding from one side to another, as if whoever was whistling was walking in. A slow, deliberate arc around his tent. He reached for the knife he kept near his sleeping bag and sat perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the nylon ceiling above him. The whistle came again, closer this time, a strange, almost playful tune. It went on for nearly an hour, sometimes fading into the distance, then returning suddenly right outside the thin fabric walls. When the first streaks of dawn crept into the forest, the sound stopped. Tyler barely waited for the light. He packed quickly and put as much distance as he could between himself and that camp. By mid-afternoon, he convinced himself it must have been another hiker. Maybe drunk, maybe lost. He felt foolish for letting it scare him. That night he camped again, deeper along the trail. And this time he built a small fire to keep himself company. The flames crackled, the smoke curled into the cold night air. He ate quickly and sat watching the shadows lengthen. Everything seemed normal until just past midnight. When the whistling returned, it began faint, far away in the trees. The same slow, drawn-out notes. Tyler's stomach knotted instantly. The sound was identical. Not similar, not close, but exact, like whoever had circled his camp the night before had found him again. This time the whistle did not circle. It came straight toward him through the woods, moving with steady purpose. Tyler gripped his knife, staring into the dark beyond the firelight. He swore he saw shapes shifting between the trees, a suggestion of movement just outside the glow. The whistling stopped abruptly, and for a moment he thought maybe it was over. But then, from directly behind him, no more than a few feet away, came the faint sound of breath, slow and raspy. He spun around, the firelight throwing his own shadow long against the trees. Nothing there. He stayed awake until dawn, every muscle tight with dread. When daylight finally arrived, he packed again and practically ran the next stretch of trail. By the third night he was exhausted. Every rustle of leaves set his nerves on edge. He decided to camp right off the trail in a clearing with good visibility. He built a bigger fire and told himself this would be the last night before cutting the trip short. That night the whistling returned, louder, closer, as if whoever was behind it no longer cared about being subtle. The sound circled him again, slow, deliberate laps around the clearing. Tyler shouted into the darkness, threatening whoever was out there. His voice cracked, echoing into the empty woods, but the whistling only grew louder, mocking almost, until it stopped suddenly and was replaced by something else. From the shadows just beyond the firelight, Tyler heard his name whispered, clear as day. In a voice he swore belonged to his grandfather, who had died years before. The voice repeated it, soft and deliberate. Tyler, over and over until his blood ran cold. He grabbed his pack and ran without looking back. He left behind half his gear, stumbling down the dark trail with only his flashlight beam bouncing across the dirt. He reached the road by dawn, pale and shaking, and flagged down a passing truck. He never returned to finish the hike. He never even told his family. When he finally admitted it years later to a friend, he said he did not care if people believed him, because he knew what he heard. That was just the first of 9 stories, and if that one unsettled you, the next will make you think twice about ever setting foot on a trail at night. The second story comes from a woman named Danielle, who spent a summer working as a ranger assistant in Shenandoah National Park. Her job was mostly simple tasks, guiding visitors, helping with trail maintenance, and reporting anything unusual. She loved the forest, the vastness of the ridges, the endless sea of green rolling into the horizon. But she admitted there was one trail she hated, one she avoided at all costs after something happened to her there one night. Danielle said the trail was short, only about a mile, a loop that circled an abandoned homestead from the 1800s. The park had kept the skeleton of the old farmhouse standing as a kind of historical curiosity. Weathered beams, a crumbling stone chimney, and the faint outline of what used to be the barn. Tourists loved it during the day, taking photos and imagining pioneer life. But at night it was a different place entirely. One evening late in July, Danielle and another ranger named Rob were assigned to check the loop trail after a group of campers reported hearing strange voices near the old house. The sun had just set, the forest buzzing with cicadas. They grabbed their flashlights and started down the dirt path. Danielle said the air seemed heavy, thicker than usual, like the humidity had doubled in just a few minutes. The deeper they went, the quieter the forest became. The cicadas faded, then the frogs, until the only sound was their boots crunching the dry earth. Rob cracked a joke to ease the tension, but Danielle barely heard it. She felt eyes on her, that prickling on the back of the neck you cannot shake. When they reached the homestead clearing, the last streaks of twilight had bled away. Their flashlights cut across the collapsed walls and tall grass. The place looked more like a grave than a house. Danielle was about to call the all clear when she saw movement. A figure standing in the doorway of the ruined farmhouse. It was tall, too tall to be a normal person, its shoulders nearly brushing the top beam, and its body seemed wrong, narrow, and stretched, like the frame of a scarecrow left too long in the rain. Danielle froze, shining her light directly at it, but the figure did not react. It just stood there, still as the rotting wood around it. Rob muttered something under his breath. Danielle said she could hear the fear in his voice. They both started backing away when the figure tilted its head, slowly, unnaturally, like a puppet on a string. The beam of Danielle's flashlight flickered, then cut out entirely, plunging them into near total darkness. Rob cursed and smacked his light until it flicked back on, but the doorway was empty, the figure gone. Danielle's heart was pounding so loud she swore it echoed. Then the sound started, faint at first, like someone whispering in another room. Dozens of voices overlapping, hissing, rising from the empty farmhouse walls. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, phrases tumbling over each other, none clear enough to understand. Danielle grabbed Rob's arm and hissed that they needed to leave. They turned and ran back down the trail, the voices following them, rising until it sounded like an entire crowd was chasing them. By the time they reached the trailhead, the forest noises returned. In a rush, cicadas, frogs, the normal night chorus, the voices cut off all at once, leaving only their ragged breathing. Rob swore under his breath, saying he would never set foot near that place again. Danielle agreed. A week later, she was called to the visitor center to deal with a family who had been camping near the same trail. They claimed their youngest child had gone missing for an hour, only to be found standing in the doorway of the old farmhouse, staring blankly into the dark. When they shook her, she snapped out of it, confused and crying, insisting she had only been gone for a minute. Danielle asked the little girl what she had seen, and the child whispered a single sentence that made her blood run cold. "They told me to stay because they're lonely." Danielle quit her seasonal job at the end of that summer and never reapplied. She said she still has nightmares of that tall figure and the way the voices seem to crawl under her skin. She believes the old farmhouse is a trap, something that feeds on loneliness and lures people in. She refuses to talk about it to this day unless pressed. Now, if you thought that was unsettling, wait until you hear the third story, because this one takes place in one of the most remote stretches of the Appalachian Trail, where the only company you might find is not human at all. The third account comes from a man named Chris, who thru-hiked the Appalachian Trail in the early 2000s. He had trained for months, packed light, and was determined to complete all 2,000+ miles. He said most of the trail was grueling, but manageable, until he reached a lonely ridge in southwest Virginia, a place some locals call Dead Man's Hollow. Chris said the hollow felt wrong from the moment he entered it. The air was stale, and the trees grew so tightly packed together, they blocked out the sun. The trail wound down into a ravine with steep walls, and as soon as he descended, all sound seemed to vanish. He tried clapping his hands once just to break the silence, and the echo that came back was warped, like it traveled too far, bouncing off something massive hidden in the dark. That night he camped on a flat patch near a creek bed. The water ran low, trickling over the rocks. He built a small fire and tried to relax, but as the night deepened, he began to notice pairs of lights in the woods, faint, like tiny glowing eyes. He told himself it was deer, maybe raccoons. But then one pair rose higher, far too high for any animal, almost level with the low branches. Chris shone his flashlight, and the lights vanished. He thought he imagined it, until they appeared again. Closer this time, always in pairs, sometimes 3 or 4 sets at once, circling his camp. He said the strangest part was that the fire did not seem to bother them. The glowing eyes would blink, then drift just outside the edge of the light, like they were waiting. At around 2 in the morning, he heard the first sound, a heavy dragging noise, like something massive pulling itself across the forest floor. The glow appeared again, but this time it was not pairs of eyes. It was dozens, maybe hundreds, scattered across the ridge, all blinking in unison. Chris backed toward the creek, clutching his knife. The dragging sound grew louder, and then he saw it, or part of it. A shape that filled the gaps between the trees. Tall and shifting, like smoke but solid, it moved without footsteps, just gliding forward. The eyes embedded in its form, blinking at different times. Chris panicked, splashing through the creek. And running up the opposite bank, he hiked until dawn without stopping, his legs screaming, his lungs burning. When he finally reached a shelter the next morning, another hiker asked what had happened to him. Chris said he could not even find the words. He just knew he would never set foot in Dead Man's Hollow again. Years later, he still says he does not believe it was an animal, or even a ghost, but something older, something that had been there long before people walked the trail. The fourth story comes from a pair of friends, Marcus and Dylan, who went on a weekend backpacking trip near the Tennessee-North Carolina border. They were both in their mid-20s, outdoorsy, and more than a little skeptical about the ghost Stories their families used to tell. They joked on the way up that the scariest thing they would probably see was a bear rummaging through their food bag. But they came back shaken, swearing they would never hike together again. They had hiked most of the day before setting up camp in a clearing tucked against a ridge. The fire crackled, the stars burned bright overhead, and everything felt normal until they noticed how cold it had gotten. Marcus said the temperature dropped in a way he had never experienced before. It was not a gradual cooling, it was as if someone had thrown open a freezer door. Their breath steamed in the air, even though it was mid-spring. Around midnight, Dylan heard it first. A voice calling faintly through the trees. It sounded like a woman, her tone desperate, pleading. Marcus jumped to his feet, flashlight in hand, and called back. Asking if she was okay, the voice answered again, but this time from the opposite direction, still distant, still pleading. The two exchanged a look, unease replacing their earlier laughter. Dylan whispered that maybe someone was lost, but Marcus felt his gut twist. The voice was wrong, too smooth, like it carried no breath, no hesitation, just perfectly formed words floating through the night. They argued for a minute about whether to investigate, when the voice came again, closer now, repeating the same phrase, "Help me, please." Marcus swore it came from right behind him. He spun around, flashlight beam slicing through the trees. But there was nothing there. Then the laughter began, high-pitched, broken, like a record skipping. It echoed from every direction at once. Dylan dropped his flashlight, scrambling to grab his pack. Marcus said the air grew so cold he could feel ice forming on the outside of his tent. The laughter kept circling them, rising higher and higher, until it stopped all at once. When silence returned, they were too shaken to speak. They sat back to back near the fire until the first light of dawn. When they finally broke camp, Marcus noticed something etched into the dirt just outside their clearing, long parallel lines, like finger marks dragging through the soil. 10 deep grooves leading straight to the spot where they had been sitting. They hiked out that morning without stopping for food or rest. Dylan moved out of state a few months later. Marcus says they never really talked about it again, except once when Dylan admitted that he still heard the voice sometimes, faint, in the background, just as he was about to fall asleep. The fifth story is shorter but no less terrifying. It comes from a hiker named Claire who camped alone near Harper's Ferry, West Virginia. She said the night had been quiet until around 3 in the morning when she woke to the sound of footsteps circling her tent. She assumed at first it was an animal, but the steps were too heavy, too slow, crunching the leaves in an unmistakably human rhythm. She whispered, asking who was there, but the steps did not pause. They just kept circling, round and round. After a while she realized they were not random. They were counting, exactly 12 slow steps. Then a pause, then 12. Again. Claire held her breath, gripping her pocket knife. She listened as the steps stopped directly at the head of her tent. Then nothing, no sound, no movement, just silence pressing down like a weight. She did not move until dawn, when she finally unzipped her tent. She found a perfect ring of footprints pressed into the ground around her camp. Too large to belong to her, too deliberate to be random. She never saw anyone, never heard another sound, but she swore that whoever had walked that circle knew she was awake, knew she was listening, and wanted her to understand she was not alone. Now, the sixth story is one that spreads around campfires more than written reports. But enough hikers have whispered versions of it that it deserves to be told. They call it the Gray Walker, a figure said to roam certain stretches of the Blue Ridge Mountains, always appearing just after dusk. One hiker named Evan claimed he saw it near a trail shelter. He was the only one there that night, writing in his journal by the fading light when he noticed movement down the path. At first he thought it was another hiker arriving late, but the figure did not carry a pack. It was tall, too thin, and its skin looked gray, even in the low light. Evan said it walked slowly, dragging one foot like it was injured, yet somehow it covered ground quickly, gliding instead of stumbling. When it reached the edge of the clearing, it stopped and turned its head toward him, Though Evan could not make out eyes, only hollows where they should have been, he froze, every instinct screaming at him to run. The figure tilted its head once, then continued down the trail, disappearing. Into the dark. Evan did not sleep at all that night, every creak of the shelter making him flinch. The next morning he found no footprints, no signs of anyone passing, just the silence of the forest. He left the trail a week later, unable to shake the image from his mind. Stories of the gray walker go back decades, hikers describing the same. Tall gray figure moving silently along the trail. Some say it is a lost soul trapped between worlds. Others say it is something older, something that watches, waiting for those who dare to hike alone. By now you are probably realizing these stories share something in common. They are not loud or flashy. They do not end with screaming faces or sudden violence. Instead they linger, quiet, personal, moments that make people question what they really saw and whether the forest itself is keeping secrets. The seventh story, however, adds a layer of menace, because it did not just involve whispers or shadows, but something that followed a hiker home. The next account comes from a man named Robert, a seasoned hiker who thought he had seen just about everything the Appalachian wilderness could throw at him. He had braved sudden storms, rough terrain, and even nights alone without proper gear. But what he encountered in late September during a solo hike through the Blue Ridge Mountains was unlike anything he could have prepared for. Robert set out early in the morning, determined to reach a ridge he had marked months before. The forest was quiet, almost too quiet. He recalled how even the birds seemed muted, their songs clipped short as if something nearby had unsettled them. The trail wound upward, the trees closing in until the sky was little more than thin strips of pale gray above his head. As he hiked, he noticed strange carvings on several tree trunks along the path. At first glance, they looked like deep claw marks, vertical grooves etched into the bark. But when he ran his fingers across them, the lines were evenly spaced, deliberate, almost like someone had used a tool to carve them. They weren't fresh, but they also weren't worn with age. He tried to brush it off, telling himself it was the work of another hiker playing around, or maybe even some local kids who had wandered too far into the woods. Still, unease prickled at the back of his neck. By late afternoon, the trail grew steeper, and Robert decided to take a break. He sat on a flat rock, sipping water, when he noticed something just beyond the tree line. A figure, standing perfectly still. Half hidden in the shadows, he squinted, thinking it might be another hiker. But the longer he looked, the less sense it made. The figure was tall, unnaturally tall, and its limbs seemed just a bit too long. It wasn't moving, not even swaying. Like someone might while standing still, Robert called out, a cautious hello, echoing through the trees. No response. The figure remained motionless. His skin crawled. He stood quickly, shouldering his pack, and started moving again, trying not to appear rattled. But every so often, when he glanced back, he swore the figure was still there, following at a distance, never stepping into the light. That night, he made camp off the trail, building a small fire to keep the chill away. The forest was thick with silence, broken only by the occasional snap of branches in the distance. He told himself it was just deer moving around. But around midnight, he woke to the sound of footsteps circling his camp, slow, deliberate steps crunching in the undergrowth. He held his breath, gripping his flashlight, and flicked it on. Nothing. Just empty trees staring back at him. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment he thought maybe it had just been his imagination. Then he saw it, standing just beyond the edge of the firelight. The same tall figure, limbs impossibly long, head tilted slightly like it was studying him. Its face, or what should have been a face, was nothing more than a pale blur, as if the details refused to come into focus. Robert froze, his chest tight, the flashlight beam shaking in his hand. When he finally found the strength to move, he threw dirt onto the fire, dousing it instantly, and scrambled into the dark. He didn't bother gathering his things. He ran. blind, branches tearing at his clothes, lungs burning with every breath. He didn't stop until he stumbled onto a dirt service road just as dawn was breaking. When he returned weeks later with friends to retrieve his abandoned gear, the spot where he had camped was exactly as he left it, except for one thing. On the rock where he had sat to rest the day before, someone had carved a single word into the stone. Stay. Robert never hiked alone again. Another chilling story comes from two friends, Emma and Lucas, who set out on a fall hiking trip in the Great Smoky Mountains. They were both experienced in the outdoors, carrying proper gear, maps, and enough food to last them days. What they weren't prepared for was how quickly a sense of adventure could turn into something terrifying. It started with a shortcut. They had planned to follow a marked trail, but midway through their hike, they noticed a narrow side path leading deeper into the trees. Lucas suggested they take it, insisting it would reconnect with the main trail. Further ahead, Emma was hesitant. She had heard too many stories of hikers getting lost in the Appalachians. But Lucas was confident, so she gave in. At first, the path seemed manageable, though overgrown in places, but soon it became clear that it hadn't been used in a long time. Branches clawed at their clothes, briars tangled around their boots, and the canopy above thickened until very little light reached the forest floor. After about an hour, they realized the path wasn't leading them anywhere near the trail. They decided to turn back, only to find that the way behind them looked nothing like the way they had come. Panic set in. Emma tried to retrace their steps, but the undergrowth seemed denser, the trees closer together. It was as if the forest had shifted behind them, sealing them inside. Lucas tried to keep her calm, saying they just needed to head west until they hit the trail, but every direction looked the same. Endless rows of trees stretching into shadow. As the sun began to sink, the woods grew unnervingly silent. The air grew heavy, and even the sound of insects seemed to vanish. That was when they noticed something strange. The trees around them bore markings, symbols carved deep into the bark, circles, spirals, and shapes that didn't resemble anything natural. Some were high above their heads, far out of reach for any person without a ladder. Others looked freshly cut, the bark still raw and bleeding sap. Emma swore the symbols weren't there when they first walked in. Lucas brushed it off as old logging marks, but the unease in his voice gave him away. They pressed on, hoping to find water or some clearing where they could get their bearings. Instead, they found something worse. In a hollow between the trees stood a ring of stones, each one taller than a person. They were arranged in a perfect circle, the ground inside worn bare, as if it had been used over and over again. At the center was a wooden structure, like a crude altar, stained dark with something that wasn't just dirt. Emma froze. The air felt colder inside the circle, heavy with the weight of something ancient. Lucas whispered that they needed to leave immediately as they backed away. A sharp crack echoed through the woods, then another, footsteps, slow, heavy, deliberate, moving closer from the shadows. Emma's breath caught in her throat. She grabbed Lucas's hand and pulled him toward the direction they thought was west. The footsteps followed, closing in, yet they never caught a glimpse of who or what was behind them. They ran until their legs burned, not stopping until they collapsed against a fallen log. Their chests heaved, and for a moment they thought they had lost it. Then Emma noticed something that made her blood run cold. Carved into the very log they were resting against was the same spiral symbol they had seen earlier, fresh, deep, as if someone had known they would end up right there. By the time they stumbled out of the forest and onto a dirt road, night had fully fallen. They flagged down a passing truck, whose driver looked at them pale and shaken when they described where they had been. He told them flatly that they should never go back, that there were places in those woods people had been avoiding for generations. Neither Emma nor Lucas ever spoke about what they saw inside that circle again, but both admitted privately to friends later that they still hear footsteps at night outside their windows, slow and deliberate, like something from the forest followed them home. Another account comes from an older man named Frank, who had lived near the Appalachian foothills all his life. He wasn't a hiker by choice, but a hunter, and he knew the land better than most. One winter, he ventured out into the woods before dawn to track deer. The snow lay thick and silent across the ground, reflecting the pale light of the moon. He followed fresh tracks through the trees until they stopped abruptly near a clearing. But instead of deer, what he found made him grip his rifle tighter. In the snow were human footprints, bare footprints. They were larger than his own, wide and deep, as if whoever made them weighed far more than an ordinary man. They walked straight across the clearing and disappeared into the tree line. Frank's instinct screamed at him to turn back, but curiosity pushed him forward. He followed the prints for nearly a mile, deeper into the forest, until the silence became suffocating. Then he smelled it, a foul, sour odor, like rotting meat left in. The sun, the hair on his neck stood up. Just as he raised his rifle, he heard something moving in the distance. Slow, dragging steps. Then came a sound he would never forget. A guttural, rasping growl, low and unnatural, echoing through the trees. He froze, finger tight on the trigger. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Whatever it was circling him, just out of sight. Frank didn't wait. He turned and bolted, crashing through the snow as fast as he could. He didn't stop until he reached his truck at the forest's edge. Heart hammering in his chest, he drove home without looking back. But when he arrived, he noticed something in the bed of his truck. Snow, fresh snow, and in the center of it, a single bare footprint. Frank never hunted in those woods again. There's another story told among hikers who frequent the Appalachian trails. A story about a man named Jared who spent much of his youth exploring those woods. Jared considered himself fearless. He often hiked alone, sometimes vanishing into the wilderness for days at a time, emerging with photographs and stories of breathtaking ridges and hidden streams. But there was one trip that he would never speak of the same way, one that left him shaken to his core. It happened in early spring when the mountains were just beginning to thaw. He set out on a multi-day hike, carrying only the essentials. For the first 2 days, everything was perfect. The weather was cool but clear, and he hadn't crossed paths with a single person, which was exactly how he liked it. The forest was his escape, a place where the noise of modern life couldn't reach him. On the third day, he noticed something odd. The trail, which should have been well marked, started to narrow until it seemed like no one had walked it for years. He stopped, pulled out his map, and realized with a sinking feeling that he had drifted off the official route. Still, he wasn't worried. He'd been lost before and always found his way back. But as the hours passed, the woods around him began to change. The air felt heavier. The trees looked older, their trunks twisted as if they had grown in pain. Moss covered everything, and the light dimmed even though the sun was still high. Then he began to hear it, a faint whisper, too low to make out words, drifting through the trees. At first he thought it was the wind, but the air was still. Each time he paused, the whisper grew clearer, as if it was waiting for him to stop moving. By nightfall, he stumbled upon a clearing. In the center stood a cabin, small and weathered, its roof sagging with age. Relief flooded him. He thought he'd found shelter. But the closer he got, the more dread crept in. The windows were black, the door slightly ajar. He called out, but his voice sounded swallowed by the woods. No response inside. The cabin was empty. Dust coated every surface, and cobwebs hung from the beams. But in the middle of the floor was a chair, just one chair, perfectly centered. Facing the door, on the seat lay a single object, an old photograph. Jared picked it up, his hands trembling. The photo was of him, standing in the very clearing where he now stood. He dropped the picture and bolted out of the cabin, his heart pounding. The whispers grew louder now, surrounding him, rising in a chorus that made no sense but filled him with terror. He ran blindly through the woods until exhaustion forced him to stop. When he finally dared to look around, he realized he had circled back to the same clearing. The cabin was waiting, its door open wider than before. That night, he didn't sleep. He sat with his back against a tree, staring at the cabin, too afraid to blink. At some point in the darkest hours, he saw movement in the doorway. A figure, tall and gaunt, stepped out, its head tilted unnaturally, as though studying him. He didn't wait to see more. He ran until his legs gave out. Jared eventually found his way back to civilization, but he refused to ever hike alone again. He burned the gear he had carried on that trip, claiming it was cursed, and though he still hikes, he will never set foot near that section of the trail again. Another unsettling account involves a woman named Clara who went hiking with her dog in the Appalachian foothills. She loved the outdoors and often trusted her dog to sense things before she did. They were about 5 miles into their trek when the dog suddenly stopped, its ears went back, and it let out a low growl, staring into the woods. Clara followed its gaze but saw nothing. The dog refused to move. It bristled, pulling against the leash as though it wanted to go back the way they had come. Clara coaxed it forward, insisting it was probably just a deer, but as they pressed on, she began to feel it too, the weight of being watched. Every few minutes, the dog would stop again, hackles raised, staring into the trees. Finally, Clara heard it herself. Footsteps, not the quick patter of an animal, but slow, deliberate crunches in the underbrush. Matching her pace, she spun around, flashlight sweeping through the trees, but nothing was there. As dusk fell, she decided to make camp. She set up her tent quickly, her dog restless by her side. All through the night, she heard the footsteps circling her camp. At one point, the dog growled so fiercely that she thought it would lunge straight through the tent fabric. She unzipped the flap just enough to look outside. What she saw made her blood run cold. At the edge of the firelight stood a figure, thin and impossibly tall, its arms hanging lower than they should. Its face was obscured by shadow, but she could see its chest rising and falling with labored breaths. She froze, clutching her dog to keep it from barking. After what felt like hours, the figure turned and disappeared into the trees. She didn't sleep for the rest of the night. At dawn, she packed up and left without eating. She walked fast, her dog constantly checking behind them. When she finally reached her car, she found something waiting on the hood, a single paw print, far too large to belong to her dog. And then there's the story told by a group of hikers who ventured into the woods near an abandoned mining town. They were curious, hoping to see remnants of the past. Old buildings, forgotten machinery. What they found instead was something far stranger. The town itself was eerie enough, the buildings sagging and broken, windows shattered, and the air heavy with silence. But as they explored, they noticed something odd in several of the buildings. The floors were covered in salt, thick, deliberate layers of it, spread evenly across every inch. None of them could explain why, but the deeper they went, the stronger the smell became, metallic, like rust and blood. One of them swore they heard whispers echoing through the empty streets. Another claimed to see movement in the windows, pale shapes ducking out of sight just as they turned their heads. That night, they camped just outside the town, but they didn't stay long. As the fire burned low, they heard voices calling their names, not all at once, but one by one. Whispered from the darkness, each voice was perfect, indistinguishable from their friends sitting by the fire. But when they looked around, every single person was accounted for. They packed up and left before dawn, vowing never to return to this day. None of them can explain how the voices knew their names. Some hikers speak of strange figures they have encountered in the most remote and isolated stretches of the Appalachian Trail. One man who had set out alone for a week of solitude claimed that he saw what appeared to be a man in ragged clothing, standing among the trees. At first, he thought it might be another hiker who had gotten lost, or perhaps even a hermit living off the land. But as he got closer, the figure seemed to dissolve into the shadows, fading back into the woods like smoke. He stood frozen, convinced that his mind must be playing tricks on him. Yet when he pressed forward, he found tracks in the soft soil. Long barefoot prints that led deeper into the forest before vanishing altogether. He never saw the figure again, but he swore he felt watched every night until he made it out of the mountains. Those who hear his story often wonder whether he encountered a ghost of an old wanderer or something much older, something that only shows itself in the loneliest corners of the trail. Another chilling account comes from a pair of hikers who had camped at a clearing one autumn evening. Had been making their dinner when they noticed what looked like a fire flickering on a ridge not far from them. They assumed other campers had set up nearby and thought little of it, but as the night stretched on, the fire never seemed to dim, and no voices ever carried through the air. Around midnight, the flames suddenly went out, leaving the ridge in complete darkness. That was when they began to hear whispers drifting through the trees. They described it as faint at first, just a low murmur, but it grew louder and closer, surrounding their campsite until it sounded as if dozens of people were speaking just beyond the tree line. Terrified, they packed their gear and left without even sleeping. When they told the story later, locals told them of a legend about an old village that had once been on that ridge where a fire had consumed the settlement. The whispers, some say, belonged to the voices of those who perished in the flames. In another tale, a seasoned hiker described the night in which the forest itself seemed to turn against him. He had been walking late into the evening, hoping to reach a shelter marked on his map. As dusk fell, he realized he would not make it and decided to set up camp along the trail. But the deeper the night grew, the more wrong everything felt. The wind died completely, the air went heavy, and the forest grew unnervingly quiet. Around 2 a.m, he awoke to the sound of sticks snapping around his tent. At first, he thought it was deer or some other animal. But then came the unmistakable sound of human footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling the tent. He called out, asking who was there, but no one responded. Instead, the footsteps stopped directly behind his tent and stayed there. He sat frozen, clutching his knife, until dawn finally came. When he crawled out of the tent, he found no tracks, no evidence that anyone had been there at all. To this day, he cannot explain who or what had stalked him that night. The Appalachians are also home to ghostly apparitions that appear near old mining towns long abandoned. One chilling account comes from a photographer who had set out to capture some of the ruins left behind by miners over a century ago. As he explored the collapsing buildings, he felt an unnatural chill sweep through the air. He raised his camera to take a shot of a doorway, but when he looked through the viewfinder, he swore he saw a man standing there. The figure wore old miner's clothing and held a lantern at his side. Startled, he lowered the camera, and the doorway was empty. When he raised it again, the miner was still there, staring directly at him through the lens. He snapped the photo in a panic, but when he checked later, the frame was completely black. That photograph still unnerves him, for he insists he pressed the shutter while staring at the figure. Some believe he captured not just an image, but a moment when the past bled into the present, a glimpse of a spirit bound forever to the ruins of the mine. Stories like these continue to circulate because the Appalachian Mountains are rich in history, pain, and forgotten lives. It is said that the land remembers every tragedy, and those who wander into the wrong place at the wrong time may brush against memories that refuse to fade. The hikers who share these encounters often speak with a tone of unease, reluctant to retell them in detail, as if voicing the stories aloud might somehow invite the same fate upon themselves. These are not tales of simple imagination or campfire folklore. They are personal experiences that carry weight, told by people who cannot shake what they saw, heard, or felt in those woods. And perhaps that is why hikers, even the most experienced ones, grow quiet when asked if they have ever encountered anything strange. Some memories, after all, are better left unspoken. Yet silence does not erase fear, it only deepens it. The more hikers try to keep their stories buried, the more powerful the legends become, and every year, more and more people set out on those trails. unknowingly stepping into landscapes that have been shaped not just by nature, but by centuries of haunting. Each hiker who ventures in might wonder whether they, too, will return with a story they will refuse to tell out loud. There are hikers who say the strangest moments do not happen at night, but in the daylight when everything should feel safe. One woman told the story of walking the sunlit path one spring afternoon, the trees alive with birds and the ground covered in fresh blooms. She felt at peace until she noticed that the birds had suddenly gone silent. The forest, once vibrant, fell into a stillness so complete it felt suffocating. She stopped to listen, trying to convince herself it was nothing more than a passing hawk. Then she heard a low humming, soft and rhythmic, coming from somewhere up ahead. She followed the sound, thinking it might be another hiker playing music. But as she rounded a bend, the humming stopped, and she found herself staring at an empty trail. No one was there. She waited, listening, but the forest remained deathly still. It was not until she turned back the way she came that the humming began again, this time just behind her, as if something was following her footsteps but refusing to be seen. She never finished that hike. She said the silence of the forest that day still visits her in her dreams. Another unsettling story involves a group of friends who had gone hiking together in the summer heat. By evening, they had set up camp near a ridge that overlooked miles of forest. As they sat by their fire, one of them pointed out a light moving among the trees below. At first, they thought it was a flashlight, someone navigating the forest at night. But then they noticed there were 3 lights, moving in unison, weaving between the trees as though searching. They watched for nearly an hour, trying to make sense of it. Then, one by one, the lights shot straight up into the air and disappeared without a sound. They sat in stunned silence, none of them wanting to admit what they had just witnessed. To this day, they struggle to describe the experience. Some whisper about spirits carrying lanterns. Others think of something far stranger, a force not entirely of this world that slips through the Appalachian woods when no one is supposed to see. Then there are the stories rooted in old cemeteries that hikers stumble upon unexpectedly. A man once recounted how he had strayed from the trail and discovered a cluster of weathered gravestones hidden under decades of leaves and moss. The dates were from the early 1800s, names half worn away by time. As he bent down to brush the dirt from one stone, he felt a sudden coldness, sharper than the autumn air. He said it was as though invisible hands had gripped his shoulders. Startled, he stood and backed away, but the chill clung to him. That night, camping nearby, he woke to hear voices whispering around his tent. They were soft, almost too faint to catch, but he swore he heard his own name spoken more than once at dawn. He returned to the cemetery to find that the gravestone he had touched had split clean down the middle during the night. Though there had been no storm, no quake, nothing that could explain it, he never touched another gravestone again, certain that some things are not meant to be disturbed. The Appalachians also carry stories of phantom sounds that mimic human voices. Hikers describe being called to from the woods, hearing what they believe to be a friend's voice or a loved one's tone, only to find no one there. One chilling case involved 2 brothers hiking together. Late one evening, as they prepared camp, one heard the other calling his name from deep in the forest. Confused, he walked toward the sound, thinking his brother had wandered off. The voice continued, always just out of reach, leading him farther into the dark. But when he finally stopped, the forest fell silent. He turned to head back and found his brother standing behind him, pale and shaking. The brother said he had never left the camp. Both had heard the voice, both had followed, and both swore it had sounded exactly like the other. Some call these mimics, spirits that lure hikers off the trail by imitating the familiar. The brothers do not know what would have happened if they had kept following the sound deeper into the trees, but they both agree on one thing: something was trying to separate them. Another unsettling encounter came from a lone backpacker traveling through a foggy valley. As the mist thickened, he began to hear the sound of someone trudging behind him. Each time he stopped, the footsteps stopped too. He spun around, flashlight cutting through the fog, but the trail was empty. The sound resumed as soon as he started walking again. Always close, always keeping pace. Hours later, when he finally reached a shelter, he felt the presence still clinging to him. He lit a fire and sat awake, staring into the mist outside. Around midnight, he heard a knock on the wooden wall of the shelter. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. He held his breath, knife in hand, but no one entered, and when he checked outside, the fog was empty. He left at dawn, certain he had been followed by something he could not see, something that wanted him to know he was never alone in that valley. These accounts leave listeners unsettled because they are not exaggerated tales of monsters or legends passed down through centuries. They are personal, grounded stories told by ordinary hikers who had no intention of encountering the unexplainable. The people who share them often speak reluctantly, almost in whispers, as if they fear the memory might come alive again if given too much attention. The mountains are filled with beauty, but also with shadows, and sometimes those shadows move, breathe, and follow. What makes these stories even more haunting is the way they linger in the mind. Each tale plants a seed of doubt, a quiet question that takes root and grows. If the silence of a forest can fall so suddenly, if footsteps can echo where no one walks, if a familiar voice can call to you from the dark when no one is there, then what else might be waiting along the trail? These are the kinds of thoughts that settle into the hearts of hikers long after they have left the mountains behind. Some hikers believe that the most dangerous encounters are not with the living, but with the echoes of those who never left. One man recounted a night when he had stopped at a dilapidated cabin deep in the woods. The structure had long since been abandoned, its roof sagging and its windows shattered. Yet he was exhausted and decided to use it as shelter. He laid out his sleeping bag on the floor, lit a small fire in the old stone hearth, and tried to settle in. Around midnight, he awoke to the sound of boots creaking across the wooden floorboards. At first, he thought it might be another hiker who had stumbled across the cabin. But when he sat up, the room was empty. The footsteps continued, pacing back and forth. Then came the sound of a door creaking open and slamming shut, though there were no intact doors left in the place. He stayed frozen until morning, leaving as soon as the sun rose. He later learned that the cabin had once belonged to a logger who disappeared in the early 1900s. His body never recovered. The man said he would never step inside another abandoned structure in the Appalachians again. Others speak of shadow figures that do not vanish when confronted. A woman hiking with her dog one evening described how the animal froze, hackles raised, staring at something just ahead on the trail. She shone her flashlight forward and saw the shape of a tall figure standing completely still. Its features were obscured, but its outline was unmistakably human. She called out, thinking it was another hiker, but the figure did not move or respond. She grew uneasy and turned to retreat, only for her dog to whimper and refuse to move. When she turned back, the figure was gone, yet the air where it had stood felt colder, as if the shadow had left behind a chill that clung to her skin. She hurried away, but the dog kept glancing over its shoulder, whining as though it could still see something trailing behind them. There are also accounts of voices carried through the mountains that seemed to come from nowhere. One hiker recalled sitting by a fire when he heard a woman's laughter echoing faintly through the trees. It was distant at first, then closer, circling his camp. He called out, wondering if someone needed help, but no answer came, only more laughter. It grew shrill and distorted until it no longer sounded human. Terrified, he grabbed his pack and walked through the night until he reached a road. He never returned to that section of the trail, insisting that the laughter still rings in his ears whenever he thinks about it. Another man had an experience that unsettled him so deeply he swore never to share it again. While hiking alone, he became disoriented and lost as the sun set. The forest grew darker and more unfamiliar with every passing minute. As he tried to retrace his steps, he heard what sounded like children singing. The sound was faint, almost like a lullaby carried on the wind. He followed it, desperate for some sign of life, hoping it might lead him to a campsite or a town, but instead, he stumbled into a clearing filled with nothing but stones arranged in strange patterns. The singing stopped immediately, replaced by silence so heavy it pressed against his chest. He fled the clearing, running blindly until he eventually found the trail again. He refuses to talk about what he saw in detail, but he warns other hikers not to follow strange sounds in the mountains, no matter how harmless they may seem. The deeper you listen to these stories, the more you begin to realize that the Appalachians are not just a place of natural beauty, but a realm of memory and presence. Every story carries the same thread: isolation, silence, and something unnatural watching just beyond sight. The locals often nod when they hear these accounts, as if none of it surprises them. They know the mountains hold secrets, and they know not all of them are meant to be spoken aloud. Even in daylight, the Appalachians can play tricks on the mind. A hiker once described walking along a ridge and suddenly seeing a figure ahead of him, dressed in old-fashioned clothing, a wide-brimmed hat casting his face in shadow. The hiker waved, but the man did not respond. Instead, he turned and walked into the trees. When the hiker reached the spot, there were no tracks, no path, and no sign that anyone had passed through. The encounter left him shaken, convinced that he had crossed paths with someone or something that belonged to another time. Some stories carry a heavier weight, rooted in tragedy. There are places along the trail where entire families once lived, before floods or landslides wiped out their homes. A woman camping near such a site woke in the middle of the night to the sound of children crying outside her tent. She unzipped the flap, heart pounding, but saw nothing. The crying grew louder, circling her campsite, then suddenly stopped. In the morning, she discovered the remnants of stone foundations nearby, overgrown with moss and vines. Locals later told her that a landslide had once buried a family that lived in that valley. She left the trail immediately after and never hiked in the Appalachians again. It is these kinds of stories, subtle, personal, and impossible to dismiss, that make the Appalachian Mountains such a place of whispered caution. Hikers do not always share them openly, but when they do, their voices shake, their eyes dart away, and their words carry the weight of something unforgettable, and perhaps that is what makes them most terrifying of all. These are not grand legends or myths meant to entertain around a fire. They are memories carved into people's lives, reminders that the mountains are alive with more than just trees and wildlife. And if these stories are true, then it means the next hiker who steps onto the trail might find themselves not just walking through nature, but through history, tragedy, and something far more unexplainable. There is one account that stands out, told by a man who had been hiking with his brother along a remote stretch of the trail. They had planned a 3-day trip, packing light and setting out with the confidence of people who thought they knew the woods well. The first day went smoothly, but on the second night, they found themselves far from any shelter or established campsite. They set up their tents in a small clearing, cooked a simple meal, and prepared for a long night of rest. Sometime after midnight, the older brother woke to the sound of his sibling whispering his name. He sat up, expecting to see the younger man peeking into his tent, but when he unzipped it, the campsite was silent. His brother's tent was still zipped shut, unmoved. He told himself he must have been dreaming and lay back down. Minutes later, he heard it again, only clearer this time, a voice just outside the tent, repeating his name in the exact tone his brother would use. He bolted upright, grabbed his flashlight, and shone it outside. Nothing, just the still trees and the faint orange glow of the dying fire. With his heart racing, he unzipped his brother's tent to wake him. The younger man stirred gradually, irritated at being disturbed, and swore he hadn't said a word all night. They tried to shake it off and return to sleep, but the whispers came again, louder. This time, both of them heard it, their names spoken in alternating tones, mimicking their own voices as though someone or something had been listening closely enough to copy them. They packed up in silence, too frightened to speak, and walked until dawn. To this day, neither of them will camp along that stretch of trail again. Another story comes from a young woman who decided to hike alone, something she had done before without trouble. She prided herself on her independence and preparation, but halfway through her trip, she began to feel the unmistakable sensation of being followed. At first, it was small things: the sound of twigs snapping behind her, the impression of movement in her peripheral vision. Then it grew more direct, footsteps trailing just behind her own, stopping whenever she stopped. By the second night, the feeling became unbearable. She woke several times to the sound of heavy breathing just outside her tent. Once, she even saw the fabric press inward slightly, as though someone or something was leaning against it. She lay frozen, barely able to breathe, until the pressure disappeared. At dawn, she unzipped the tent and looked around. Nothing, no footprints, no signs of disturbance. She left immediately, abandoning part of her gear just to get out faster. Later, she admitted she could never decide what frightened her more: that there was someone in the woods with her, or that there wasn't. Some accounts involve places that seem to warp time itself. A group of hikers once spoke about losing hours of daylight without explanation. They set out early, hiked steadily, and by their calculations should have reached a certain landmark well before sunset. But as they walked, the woods around them grew darker, faster than seemed possible. When they checked their watches, nearly 3 hours had passed in what felt like minutes. Panic set in as they rushed toward their destination. But when they finally arrived, the sun had already vanished below the horizon. None of them could explain the lapse, and all of them agreed it felt unnatural, as if the mountains themselves had played a trick on their sense of time. Then there are the stories that feel less like encounters and more like warnings. One man recalled sitting at a fire when an older hiker wandered into his camp uninvited. The man looked weathered, his clothes ragged, his eyes sharp but distant. He sat without speaking, warming his hands by the fire. Finally, he said one sentence: "You should not be here tonight." Then he stood and walked back into the woods. The camper thought it strange but didn't feel threatened, until he awoke hours later to the sound of distant screams. He never saw the old man again, but the warning has haunted him ever since. Even those who survive the Appalachians, with nothing more than strange memories, agree on one thing: silence can be the loudest sound of all. One hiker described how the forest went utterly still around him. Not a bird, not an insect, not even the wind moving through the branches. He said the silence pressed in until he felt his chest tightening, his breath ragged. Then, just as suddenly, the sound of the forest returned, except for one thing: a faint, rhythmic knocking, like wood tapping against wood, echoing from somewhere deeper in the trees. He didn't stay to investigate. The most chilling accounts, however, come from those who stumble upon signs that they are not alone and never were. A camper in the Smoky Mountains woke to find small piles of stones stacked neatly outside his tent, each one arranged in an identical pattern. He had gone to sleep with nothing there, and yet in the night, something had built them. Another hiker told of finding handprints smeared in what looked like ash on the outside of his tent flap. The marks were too high to be a child's and too small to be a grown man's. These subtle signs, almost ritualistic in nature, terrify more than any direct sighting. They suggest something with intent, something that knows hikers are there, something that chooses to leave a mark. And once you've been marked, it's hard not to wonder if you were meant to leave at all. The Appalachian Mountains stretch for hundreds of miles, their ridges and valleys carrying history deeper than the soil itself. Every trail is a story, every shadow a reminder that beauty and terror often walk hand in hand. And while many hikers share their stories reluctantly, others hold them close, refusing to speak them aloud for fear of summoning back whatever watched them in the dark. Because in these mountains, silence is not safety. Sometimes silence means something is listening.